Ah, the Three Stooges. What can I say? I love the Three Stooges. They are my absolute favorite comedy group. However, they are one of the few groups in history where everyone is divided by the different eras that they were in, whether it be the Healy era, Curly era, Shemp era, Besser era, or the Derita era. That's a lot of eras that this group had gone through, and all of this occurred in about a half a century. So I'm actually going to review each era, going over their pros and cons. So let's get started. Let's start with the Healy era. Now, we all know that this act started in the 1920s in vaudeville, originally with Ted Healy as the leader, and eventually the full group of Moe, Larry, and Shemp as his stooges. Shemp would leave the act in the early 1930s after constant disagreements with Ted and would be replaced by his and Moe's kid brother Curly. Shortly after this, Ted and the Stooges would be signed to MGM to produce shorts and have parts in feature films as well. Now, many people have a variety of opinions about the Stooges shorts and comedy style with Ted Healy. Some find it funny, while others find that it lacks the upbeat tempo of their work with Columbia later on. Me, personally, I love the shorts. I'm especially a fan of nursery rhymes and beer and pretzels, which I think shows the group doing some of their finest work. I think a lot of the negative opinions on the lineup from the younger audiences perspective comes from the fact that it's tough seeing Moe as one of the Stooges and someone else taking on the leader role. Healy is also much more soft-spoken when in character than Moe would become with Columbia's Three Stooges, which is also a big contrast. The biggest complaint from fans is Curly's lack of zaniness in the films. He's not nearly as childlike as he would become later on, and while still using a somewhat high-pitched voice, it's closer to his real voice than his work with the Three Stooges with Columbia. I personally love these shorts and have found that a lot of the older lifelong fans also love them. They might be different, but they're still great in their own way. After leaving Healy and MGM, Moe, Larry, and Curly would eventually get a shot at Columbia Pictures and would sign a long-term contract with the studio due to their early success with their first two pictures. This is often seen as the highlight of the Stooges' careers, and I agree for the most part. The production value in the Stooges' first 5 to 6 years with the studio seemed far greater than that of MGM, who didn't view shorts in high regards as Columbia did. The writing for the shorts was spectacular, and the chemistry between the actors was great. It also helped that Curly was given far more dialogue and was able to be more creative than his MGM days, bringing with him a character that everyone remembers and will live on forever. From the early years, my two favorite shorts were Three Little Beers and Disorder in the Court. Now, that's not to say that this era didn't have its downside. By the 1940s, production costs for both shorts and features grew rapidly due to World War II, and cuts had to be made. For instance, shooting outdoors was pretty much impossible for many shorts, and the writing was simplified to some small degree. I personally have very few favorites from the 1940s during Curly's era, and to add to the depressing decline was also Curly's physical decline. His decline forced a lot of the comedy to shift to Moe and Larry and made the comedy feel more forced. Curly would suffer a stroke during the production of Half-Wit's Holiday and would leave the act permanently. If I had to pick any real standout short from Curly's 1940s shorts, it would be Microphonies, which was also really good. After Curly's stroke, Moe and Larry would recruit Shemp to take over his place, and what was originally supposed to be a temporary assignment turned into a permanent one due to Curly's death in 1952. Shemp's re-entry into the act is commonly mixed reviewed, mainly due to whatever age you are as a fan and how much you know about the act in general. A lot of the younger audience didn't and still don't know that Shemp was the original third stooge in the act, and many who thought that Shemp was imitating Curly didn't know that all of the actions he brought to his role was all his own creation. Shemp's time with the Stooges in general is pretty mixed overall. By this point in time, Columbia's short films were done by two directors, Jules White and Edward Burns. While White was a very stiff and cartoony director, Burns was not. In fact, Burns preferred quality shorts over the cartoony, violence-filled shorts that White did. Burns also allowed the Stooges room to improvise with the material, unlike White, who had a tendency to tell his actors what to do. Not that Jules White was terrible, he had his share of great shorts like Hold That Line, which is awesome and one of my favorites, but when you look at Burns' work that included Fright Night, brideless grooms, whodunit, and more, it's a tough act to follow. By 1952, Burns would leave the shorts film department at Columbia, leaving only Jules White in charge of directing and producing the shorts. It was during this time that I felt Shemp's era really took a bad hit. There were a couple good shorts like Tricky Dicks and Goof on the Roof, but the rest were all nothing but rehashed shorts using footage from older shorts with minimal new footage. The acting in all of the new footage is stiff, too, due to White's direction, and the quality of the new footage was well below par of the old footage that was being shown. However, one of the cool things about Shemp's era was the birth of TV. While it was eventually the thing that would kill the Stooges, it made for one particular cameo that I love, and that's their cameo on The Ed Wynn Show. And being a huge fan of Wynn, this is one episode that I watch constantly. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's really worth it. Unfortunately, the Stooges would be dealt another blow in 1955 with the sudden death of Shemp, as he would die of a heart attack only 3 years after Curly's passing. With very few options left in short films for a third Stooge, they brought in Joe Besser. I'm going to admit right here and right now that I actually like Besser's era more than most. I generally like Besser's work to begin with, and I found him to be a good comedian on his own. A lot of people thought that Joe Besser brought down the Stooges in some way because he wasn't as willing to get hit as much as Larry, Shemp, or Curly. The fact is that when Besser came along in 1956 for the Stooges, Moe and Larry were beginning to slow down themselves, and they were both in their mid to late 50s, so the humor was bound to be slowed down whether Besser came along or not. With that said, one of the reasons I like Besser's era is because the addition of him meant that Jules White couldn't use as much stock footage as before. Besser's shorts, while some being remakes, sometimes shot for shot, there was also a lot that were freshly written stories with all new footage, which was nice. I love shorts like Hoofs and Goofs, Outer Space Jitters, and my absolute favorite being Merry Mix-Up. I think because Besser was so different from Curly and Shemp that it just brought this natural reaction of rejection from fans who had grown accustomed to Curly and or Shemp's zaniness on screen. Joe Besser was not that zany character. He was a more quiet and whiny character, which a lot of fans rejected right off the bat, and it was unfortunate because I think there is plenty of great comedy in Besser's shorts that a lot of people miss. Derita is another one that seems to get a really strange reaction from fans. While not all reject him, there is this debate amongst a lot of fans on whether or not to like him. Derita had an almost identical upbringing in show business as the Stooges and seemed like the perfect fit for the team. Derita was always tough for me to review because live footage of him is really tough to find. A lot of his live footage is either archival live show footage with no sound or the cartoons, which had minimal live footage in them. Like Besser, I'm a fan of Derita and his other work outside of the Stooges. In fact, like Besser as well, he did other short films with Columbia. Derita's persona as the third Stooge was more calm and not as loud as Curly and Shemp, but also not as whiny as Besser. However, given the time and their age, that really fit. I find Derita to be really funny, and I think that he brought the best that he could offer to the role. While I despise the cartoons, the live-action stuff that I've seen, including finally getting my hands on one of the films, The Outlaws is Coming, he does very well and fits in well with Moe and Larry. So that was the Three Stooges. There was originally supposed to be another era with Emil Sitka taking over Larry as the middle Stooge after Larry suffered a stroke and was forced to leave the act. Unfortunately, this lineup would never shoot any footage as Moe was sick with lung cancer and died shortly after Larry died. Joe Derita would also try to form his own Stooge lineup, but illness would force him to drop out of the project completely. So overall, the Stooges went through a lot of changes from beginning all the way to the end, but I found all forms funny in their own way. While some of the lineups had their flaws, they were still fun to watch, and the act still makes us laugh to this day. Well, everyone, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.